The world had dissolved into a churning chaos of water and wind. Rain did not fall from the sky. It was thrown, hurled in horizontal sheets that stung the skin and stole the breath. Each gust of wind was a physical blow, threatening to tear the canvas cover from the wagon bows and send it sailing into the gray oblivion of the Wyoming plains. Inside, Clara huddled on the hard wooden seat, her knuckles white where she gripped its edge. The driver, a grim man named Jebediah, whose face seemed carved from old leather, said nothing, his attention fixed on the two mules straining against their harnesses. Their dark hides were slick with rain, their ears laid flat against their skulls in misery. Clara was soaked through. The fine wool of her traveling dress, a deep blue chosen by her mother for its practicality, was now a heavy, sodden shroud that clung to her limbs, leaching the warmth from her body. A relentless chill had settled deep in her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with the hollow space where her future was supposed to be. She was trembling, a fine, ceaseless tremor that started in her hands and radiated through her entire being. She was newly married. The words felt like a lie in her mind, a bitter joke. She had stood beside the man, Ethan, for less than 10 minutes in the dusty office of a circuit judge 2 days ago. There were no flowers, no loving glances, only the scratch of a pen on a ledger and the clink of coins as her father's debt was officially settled. She was the final payment. The wagon lurched, its wheels sinking into a muddy rut before the mules. With a great heaving effort, pulled it free. Through the curtain of rain, she saw it. It was less a ranch and more a wound upon the land. A small, dark cabin stood against the fury of the storm, its log walls stained near black by the relentless weather. A crooked porch, a half-finished corral, and a listing barn completed the scene of bleak isolation. This was her new home. This was her life. Jebediah pulled the mules to a halt near the porch and grunted, a sound that served as his farewell. He did not get down. He did not help her. He had been paid to deliver the goods, and his part was done. Clara pushed aside the damp canvas flap and hesitated, the wind snatching at her breath. The short distance from the wagon to the cabin door seemed a mile long, a journey across a foreign and hostile country. Taking a shuddering breath, she climbed down, her boots sinking into the thick, sucking mud. It clung to her hem, heavy and cold. Every step toward the cabin door was a surrender. The door remained closed. For a terrible moment, she wondered if he had changed his mind, if he would simply leave her out here to be swallowed by the storm. She raised a trembling, numb hand to knock, but before her knuckles could touch the wood, the door swung inward. He stood there, a silhouette against the dim light of the cabin's interior. Ethan? Her husband. He was taller than she remembered from their brief, humiliating encounter at the judge's office. His shoulders were broad, filling the doorway, a solid and intimidating presence. The gray light of the storm-racked afternoon fell upon his face, and it was a landscape as harsh as the one surrounding them. His features were hard, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines. A scar, a pale, jagged line, cut down from his left temple to the corner of his jaw, a permanent reminder of some past violence. His eyes, a shade of blue so dark they were almost gray, held no welcome. They assessed her, taking in her drenched form, her trembling hands, her frightened face, with a flat, dispassionate gaze. He was a man who had seen too much of the world's ugliness to be moved by the sight of one more miserable creature. Reluctance was etched into the tight set of his mouth, the rigid line of his shoulders. He did not want her here. He stepped back without a word, a silent, grudging invitation. Clara scurried past him, careful not to brush against his body, and entered the cabin. The door closed behind her with a solid, final thud, shutting out the roar of the storm and trapping her in a silence that was somehow louder. The air inside was cold, thick with the smell of damp wood, old smoke, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like old blood or old sorrows. The cabin was a single room, larger than she had expected but profoundly empty. A stone fireplace, dark and cold, dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the floor. In one corner was a bed, a simple frame with a thin mattress and a neatly folded wool blanket. In another, a dry sink and a few shelves held a sparse collection of tin plates and mugs. There were no curtains on the single window, no rug on the floor, no pictures on the walls. It was a place a man might exist, but not a place where anyone could live. It was a shelter, not a home, and the stark emptiness of it reflected the man who inhabited it. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, thick with all the things they could not say to each other. He was a stranger. She was an obligation. The storm outside seemed a pale echo of the one contained within these 4 walls, a tempest of fear, resentment, and a deep, shared loneliness that neither could yet name. "There's a trunk," she said, her voice a small, wavering thing in the oppressive quiet. "On the wagon." Ethan gave a curt nod, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. He pulled on a heavy oilskin coat, opened the door, and disappeared back into the deluge. Clara was left alone in the cold, dim room, her own shivering a frantic counterpoint to the cabin's stillness. She looked toward the fireplace, a primitive and desperate need for warmth driving her forward. A small pile of kindling and a few split logs lay in a wooden box on the hearth. She knelt, her frozen fingers fumbling with the flint and steel she found on the mantel. Her hands shook too violently. The flint slipped, striking her knuckle, and she hissed in pain. Dropping it, she tried again, her frustration mounting with each failed attempt. A spark flew, then another, but they died before they could catch on the tinder. She was useless. A sob, tight and hot, rose in her throat. She was cold and frightened and utterly, hopelessly useless. The door opened again, and Ethan entered, carrying her small, damp trunk as if it weighed nothing. He set it down by the foot of the bed without a word. He saw her then, kneeling on the cold stones of the hearth, defeated. His expression did not change, but a muscle twitched in his scarred jaw. He walked over, his heavy boots loud on the wooden floorboards. He did not speak. He simply knelt beside her, taking the flint and steel from her unresisting hands. Clara watched him, her breath held tight in her chest. She expected roughness, impatience. His hands were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred, the fingers thick. They were the hands of a man who fought and labored, hands that knew violence. But the way he moved was not violent. He handled the small pieces of tinder with a surprising delicacy, arranging them with a practiced, efficient grace. His movements were economical, precise. He struck the flint against the steel once, a sharp, clean sound. A shower of bright sparks fell onto the tinder, and a tiny orange ember began to glow. He leaned in and blew on it, a soft, steady breath, coaxing the ember into a small, hungry flame. He added a piece of kindling, then another, his large hands shielding the fragile fire, nurturing it. In those moments, watching him, Clara saw something that unsettled her more than his stern silence. She saw a gentleness. It was there in the careful way he built the fire, in the controlled patience of his actions. It was a profound contradiction to the hard lines of his face, the coldness in his eyes, the scars that spoke of a brutal past. This man, this hardened stranger who was now her husband, was capable of a tenderness he clearly worked so hard to conceal. The memory of her father's last words to her rose up, a bitter taste in her mouth. He had stood before her, his eyes unable to meet hers, his face pale with shame and desperation. "He is a hard man, Clara," he had said, his voice rough. "But he fought for the Union. He has a piece of land. He gave his word. He promised he'd be gentle." A promise made by one man about another. A promise she had no reason to believe. The words escaped her lips before she could stop them. A whisper of sound so faint it was nearly lost in the crackle of the growing fire. "You promised you'd be gentle." It was not an accusation. It was a plea, a ghost of a hope she did not even know she still possessed. His hands stilled over the fire. His whole body went rigid. The muscle in his jaw jumped again, a violent, tight clench. For a long second, he did not move, did not breathe. Then, slowly, he placed the last log on the flames and rose to his feet, turning his back to her. He did not respond. He offered no word of comfort, no confirmation, no denial. His silence was an answer in itself, a wall of stone she could not hope to breach. The small warmth from the fire did little to chase away the profound chill that settled over her heart. Later, after she had changed into a dry chemise and huddled under the single rough blanket on the bed, the true measure of her fear began to set in. Night fell, and the storm intensified, as if drawing strength from the darkness. Thunder, a deep, guttural roar, rolled across the plains, and the cabin walls seemed to tremble with each concussion. The wind shrieked around the eaves like a tormented spirit. Clara lay on her back, her eyes wide open in the dark, listening to the sounds of the storm and the sounds of the man. He had not come to bed. He sat at the table, the scrape of his chair on the floorboards a sharp, jarring sound in the quiet. A faint clink of glass against wood told her he was drinking. She could not see him, but she could feel his presence, a heavy, brooding weight in the small room. She was afraid of him, of the coiled tension she sensed in him, the violence that seemed to simmer just beneath his skin. But her fear ran deeper than that. She was afraid of this life, of the crushing, endless loneliness that stretched out before her. She was a prisoner here, locked in this cabin with a silent, haunted man, with no hope of escape. A brilliant fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the cabin in a stark, momentary flash of white. In that brief light, she saw him, sitting at the table, a bottle and a glass before him. His head bowed. The flash faded, plunging the room back into darkness, but the image was burned into her mind. The lightning triggered a memory, just as sharp and sudden. Another flash, and she was back in her father's study. The room smelled of old paper and despair. Her father sat behind his desk, his face buried in his hands. The ledgers were open, a testament to his failure, to a series of bad investments and worse luck that had brought their family to ruin. "There is no other way. Clara," he had mumbled, his voice thick with a shame so profound it had seemed to suck the very air from the room. "Mr. Blackwood, he has agreed to forgive the debt. In exchange for her, she was a commodity, a piece of property to be traded." Another clap of thunder, and the memory shifted. Her mother, standing in the doorway of her bedroom as she packed her small trunk. Her mother had not cried. Not at first. Her face was a mask of stoic grief, her hands twisting a small lace handkerchief over and over again. But when Clara had turned to her, her own eyes brimming with tears, her mother's composure had shattered. A single, silent tear had traced a path through the fine powder on her cheek. A small, perfect teardrop of utter helplessness. They had held each other, two women trapped by a world that gave them no choices. The final image, brought on by another flash of lightning, was of the journey itself. The long, rattling ride in the wagon, leaving behind the green hills of Ohio for this vast, empty land. The feeling of being erased, of her old life and her old self vanishing with every mile that passed. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, tight knot in her stomach. The shame of being sold, the shame of being unwanted, the shame of being a debt, paid in full. Across the room, Ethan stared out the window, but he did not see the rain or the lightning. The thunder was not thunder. It was the rhythmic, earth-shaking boom of cannon fire. The flashes of lightning were not from the sky. They were the orange bursts of artillery shells exploding over a darkened field. He took a long pull from the whiskey bottle, the fiery liquid doing little to burn away the images that flickered behind his eyes. He was in Tennessee. The air was thick with smoke, so dense it burned the lungs and made the eyes water. The smell was something he would never forget, a sickening combination of sulfur, scorched earth, and burning flesh. The fields were on fire, the dry cornstalks blazing like torches against the night sky, casting a hellish orange glow over the landscape. The screams, God, the screams, they were the worst part. They echoed in his memory, a chorus of agony that the whiskey could never quite drown out. He saw his brother, Samuel, lying in the mud, his face pale in the firelight. Samuel had been younger, softer, a boy who wrote poetry and saw beauty in the world, a boy who had no place in the butchery of war. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his side, and his blue Union jacket was stained a dark, glistening black. Ethan had knelt beside him, trying to hold him together, his hands slick with his brother's lifeblood. "Don't let me die here, Ethan," Samuel had whispered, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. "Don't let this be the last thing I see." But it was another flash of lightning. He remembered holding Samuel's hand as the life faded from his eyes. He remembered the promise he had made to his dying brother, a desperate, foolish vow whispered into the chaos. "I'll be better," he'd sworn. "I'll never raise my hand in anger again. I'll build something. I will not be this man anymore." He took another drink, the whiskey a familiar poison. He had broken that promise 100 times over. The war had burned away whatever gentleness he might have once possessed, leaving only this hard, scarred shell. And now, this woman was here, this girl, with her frightened eyes and trembling hands, a girl who had whispered a plea that echoed the promise he had failed to keep. "You promised you'd be gentle." He had promised nothing to her, but he had promised his brother, and in the face of her quiet terror, he felt the full, crushing weight of his failure. He did not know how to be gentle anymore. He was not sure that man even existed. The part ended there, in the deep, suffocating darkness of the cabin. The storm raged on, a wild and violent force of nature. Inside, 2 strangers lay awake, separated by a few feet of wooden floorboards but isolated by impassable mountains of pain and memory. The thunder shook the walls. The wind howled its mournful song, and neither of them could find a moment of peace. The storm outside was a reflection of the one that churned within their own broken souls, a tempest that had only just begun. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world remade in shades of brown and gray. A weak, watery light filtered through the cabin window, revealing a landscape weeping mud. The wind had died down to a mournful sigh that whispered through the chinks in the log walls. Clara had not slept. She had listened to the storm's retreat and the man's restless stirring in his chair until the darkness began to fade. When she finally rose from the bed, stiff and cold, he was already gone. The door was shut, but the scent of the damp, clean air and the faint, rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood told her he was outside, already at war with the day. Her new life began not with a word or a glance, but with the cold, unyielding reality of the chores that awaited her. She found a milking pail on a peg by the door. It was a clear, unspoken directive. Outside, the mud was ankle-deep, a thick, greedy substance that tried to pull the boots from her feet with every step. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. In the small, leaning barn, a single dun-colored cow with soulful brown eyes turned its head to watch her approach. The animal was patient, more patient than Clara felt with herself as she fumbled with the 3-legged stool and the cold pail. Her hands, accustomed to embroidery needles and the smooth keys of a pianoforte, were clumsy and weak. The cow flicked its tail, impatient with her fumbling, and for a moment Clara thought she might simply sit there and weep. But the thought of Ethan returning to find her crying over a pail of unspilt milk was more humiliating than the struggle itself. So she persisted, her jaw set, until a thin, hissing stream of warm milk finally hit the bottom of the pail. After the milking came the water. The well was a stone-lined hole in the ground 100 yards from the cabin, and the bucket felt as though it were filled with rocks. She hauled it up hand over hand, her palms screaming in protest, the rope scraping her skin raw. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, agonizing shuffle, her arms burning, the two heavy buckets of water sloshing against her legs, soaking her skirt in the icy cold. Then came the horses, two sturdy geldings who watched her with intelligent eyes as she forked hay into their mangers, the dust from the loft catching in her throat and making her cough. The land was everything she had feared, a brutal, unforgiving expanse of mud and wind, and, as the sun climbed higher, a fine, pervasive dust that settled on everything, coating her tongue and grating behind her eyes. Through it all, Ethan was a silent, relentless presence. He worked from the first hint of light until the last vestiges of it had bled from the sky. He moved with a grim, single-minded purpose, mending the section of corral fence the storm had damaged, clearing a fallen tree from the path to the creek, his movements economical and powerful. He spoke only when absolutely necessary, his words clipped and devoid of warmth. "The kindling is low. There's more flour in the sack by the hearth." He never looked directly at her for more than a second, his gaze always sliding away, as if the sight of her was an irritation. More telling than his silence was his careful, deliberate avoidance of her. In the confines of the small cabin, they moved like two opposing magnets, a tangible field of force pushing them apart. If she was at the hearth, he was at the table. If she reached for a plate on the shelf, he would wait until her hand had retreated before reaching for his own. One evening, as she was adding a log to the fire, she stumbled, her arm brushing against his as he passed behind her. He flinched, a sharp, violent recoil, as if she had burned him. He muttered something under his breath, a low curse directed at himself, and the space between them grew colder, wider. She learned to make her own body smaller, to anticipate his movements, to exist in the margins of his life. A week passed in this tense, silent rhythm. The need for supplies became unavoidable. The nearest town, a dusty collection of false-fronted buildings called Redemption, was a half-day's ride away. Ethan announced his intention to go in a flat, emotionless tone. Clara, desperate for a change of scenery, for the sight of another human face, asked if she could accompany him. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, crossed his face before it was replaced by his usual stony mask. "The wagon is slow. It will take the whole day," he said. It was not a refusal, but it was not an invitation. "I will be ready," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. The town of Redemption was aptly named, for it looked as though it were perpetually seeking forgiveness for some unspoken sin. The people on the street moved with a weary purpose, their faces etched with the hardships of frontier life. But as Clara walked beside Ethan toward the mercantile, she felt their eyes on her. She saw the women stop their conversations, their heads turning to follow her progress, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. She saw the men, lounging on the boardwalk, tip their hats not in respect, but in a kind of knowing, insolent appraisal. She was the newcomer, the stranger, Ethan Blackwood's woman, and they all seemed to know the story of how she had come to be here. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured leather, and chewing tobacco. A portly man with a slick, thinning hair and a stained apron stood behind the counter. He greeted Ethan with a curt nod. "Blackwood." Then his gaze shifted to Clara, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "And this must be the new bride." Clara forced a polite smile. "Good morning. I am Clara Blackwood." The storekeeper, whose name she learned was Silas, chuckled, a low, wet sound. "So formal. We ain't got much use for fancy speech out here. Mrs. He leaned forward, his small, piggy eyes gleaming with malice. "Heard your PA sent you all the way from back east. Must have been a powerful debt." The word struck her like a physical blow. The color drained from her face. She felt Ethan tense beside her, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But he said nothing. Clara stood her ground, her chin held high, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. She recited her list of needs, Flour, salt, beans, kerosene, her voice unnaturally clear and precise, a shield against his cruelty. Silas filled her order with a deliberate, insulting slowness. As he handed her the final parcel, a small bag of sugar, his knuckles brushed against hers. He held on for a second too long, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "A pleasure doing business with you," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It ain't every day we get to see such a pretty debt paid in full." That was when Ethan moved. He did not raise his voice. He simply stepped forward, placing himself between Clara and the storekeeper. He laid a hand on the counter. His fingers splayed. The gesture was deceptively casual, but the look in his eyes was lethal. "The lady is my wife, Silas," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You will show her respect, or I will tear this store apart, piece by piece, and you with it." With. The smile vanished from Silas's face. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his fleshy neck, and took a hasty step back from the counter. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that was heavier than ever before. Clara sat beside Ethan on the wagon seat, staring straight ahead, the storekeeper's mocking words echoing in her mind. The pretty debt. It was what she was. It was all she would ever be to these people. When they finally arrived back at the cabin, she went about the evening chores in a numb haze, her movements mechanical. She prepared their simple meal of bacon and beans, and they ate in their usual silence. But this time, the silence was filled with her shame. That night, she could not hold it in any longer. After she was sure Ethan was asleep, or at least pretending to be, she turned her face into her thin pillow and wept. She cried without sound, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs, the tears hot against her cold skin. She cried for the life she had lost, for the respect she would never have, for the crushing weight of the bargain that had defined her existence. In his chair at the table, Ethan heard everything. He sat in the darkness, a glass of whiskey untouched before him, and listened to the muffled sounds of her grief. Each small, choked sob was a nail being driven into his conscience. He wanted to go to her, to say something, anything, to stop her pain. But what could he say? The storekeeper had only spoken the truth, a truth Ethan himself had created. He was the one who had accepted this bargain, who had taken this woman as payment for her father's foolishness. He was the source of her humiliation. His hands, resting on the table, slowly clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white in the faint moonlight. He could face a line of charging rebels. He could endure the pain of a bullet wound, but he could not face the sound of this woman's tears. It was a sound that unmanned him, that stripped him of his defenses and left him raw and exposed. The memory rose unbidden, as it always did when he felt this sharp, impotent rage. He was back in that burning field in Tennessee, the air thick with the screams of dying men. He saw his brother, Samuel, his face pale, his breath catching in his throat. Samuel had been afraid, but he had also been angry. "It's not supposed to be like this, Ethan," he had whispered, his voice a fragile thread of sound. "People aren't supposed to do this to each other. Promise me you won't be a part of it. Promise me you'll never hurt another soul." A boy's dying wish, a fool's promise made in the heart of a slaughterhouse. And Ethan had promised. Now, listening to the woman in his bed cry because of him, that promise felt like a cruel joke. He was hurting her every day, with his silence, with his distance, with the very fact of his existence in her life. The promise was not just broken, it was impossible. The next day, the tension between them was a sharp, brittle thing. Clara moved with a quiet, wounded grace, her eyes shadowed and downcast. Ethan worked with a frantic energy, trying to outrun the guilt that gnawed at him. Late in the afternoon, he was splitting the last of a large pile of logs, the axe rising and falling in a powerful, steady rhythm. Clara came out of the cabin, carrying a dipper of fresh water. She approached him hesitantly. "I brought you a drink," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You have been working so hard. I wanted to thank you." He stopped, the axe buried in the chopping block, and turned to face her. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. He looked at her, at the dipper held out in her trembling hand, at the earnest, pained look in her eyes, and he saw, not gratitude, but pity. He saw the woman of refinement, looking down upon the brute who had bought her. He saw the creditor, assessing the value of her purchase. His own self-loathing twisted her simple gesture into an insult. "I don't need your thanks," he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "And I don't need your pity. I do my work, you do yours. That's the arrangement." The light in her eyes died. The dipper wavered in her hand. She said nothing. She simply turned and walked back into the cabin, her back straight, her small figure radiating a profound and desolate loneliness. Ethan watched her go, the axe handle slick with sweat in his hand. He wanted to call her back, to explain, to take back the cruel words, but he did not know how. The rage and shame were a gag in his throat. He turned back to the chopping block and swung the axe with a savage, desperate force, as if he could split his own misery in two. That evening, the storm returned. It came on suddenly, the sky turning a bruised, violent purple, the wind rising to a high, keening shriek. The first clap of thunder was a sudden, violent crack, as if the sky itself had split open. It shook the roof of the cabin, the rafters groaning in protest. Clara was standing by the window, watching the lightning etch jagged patterns against the dark clouds. At the sound of the thunder, she flinched, a small, involuntary movement. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if to hold her own fragile body together. Ethan was at the hearth, adding another log to the fire. He watched her reflection in the dark glass of the window pane. He saw her fear, the same fear he had seen on her face the night she arrived. And he saw his own failure, reflected back at him. She turned from the window, her face pale in the flickering firelight. She looked at him, her eyes wide and haunted, and she spoke the words that had hung in the air between them since that first night, the words that had become both a plea and an accusation. "You promised you'd be gentle." This time, it was different. It was not a whisper to herself. It was a direct address. A question, a demand for an answer. This time, he did not turn away. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he let her see past the hard, angry facade. He let her see the broken thing that lived inside him. His face, in that moment, was a mask of such profound and weary pain that it stole the breath from her lungs. It was the face of a man who had been to hell and had never quite found his way back. He sank down into the chair at the table, his body slumping as if the strings that held him upright had been cut. He stared at his hands, turning them over and over, as if they belonged to a stranger. "I don't remember how," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "The war. It burns things out of a man. The gentleness is the first thing to burn." He began to speak, and the words came out not in a steady narrative, but in a torrent of broken images, the fractured memories he had kept locked away in the dark. He spoke of the fire, not the comforting warmth of a hearth, but the wild, consuming hunger of a burning field, a burning barn, a burning town. He spoke of the screams, a sound that had woven itself into the fabric of his nightmares. He spoke of the smell, the thick, cloying stench of gunpowder and mud and blood, a smell he sometimes thought still clung to his own skin, no matter how hard he scrubbed. He did not tell her the story of his brother. He could not, but he gave her the pieces of the horror that had made him, the raw, ugly truth of his past. Clara listened. She did not speak, did not interrupt. She stood by the window, the storm raging outside, and simply listened. She heard the pain beneath the words, the guilt that had been eating him alive for years, and she felt not fear, but a deep, aching wave of compassion. He was not a monster. He was a man, wounded and lost, trying to navigate a world that no longer made sense to him. When he finally fell silent, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the drumming of the rain on the roof. The air between them had changed. The anger was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative stillness. The hardness in his eyes had softened, leaving behind a raw vulnerability. Slowly, hesitantly, he looked up at her, and then he did something that shocked them both. He lifted his hand, palm up, and reached across the small space that separated them. It was not a demand, not a gesture of ownership. It was an offering, a silent request for a connection he did not know how to ask for with words. Clara looked at his outstretched hand, the same hand she had seen build a fire with such care, the hand of a man who had just shown her the deepest wounds of his soul. A part of her, the part that had just listened to his story, wanted to take it. But as his fingers came closer, another, older fear rose up. A cold, sickening wave of panic. A memory, sharp and brutal, flashed through her mind. Another hand, reaching for her, not with gentleness, but with a bruising force. She flinched. It was a small, sharp, involuntary movement, a recoil of her entire body. She pulled her hand back as if from a hot stove, a choked gasp escaping her lips. The light in Ethan's eyes died. He slowly withdrew his hand and placed it back on the table, curling it into a fist. The wall was back up, the connection broken. He had offered her the only piece of himself he had left, and she had recoiled from it. They sat there for a long time, on opposite sides of the room. As the storm spent its fury on the world outside, the lightning flashed, illuminating the stark, lonely cabin, catching the glint of unshed tears in her eyes and the fresh sheen of pain on his. They were two lost souls, adrift in a sea of their own private sorrows, who had, for a brief, fleeting moment, caught sight of each other, only to be pulled apart again by the tide. They were unsure if they could ever find a way to meet in the middle. The fragile truce born in the heart of the storm did not last. The confession had cracked the ice between them, but the water below was still frozen and deep. In the weeks that followed, a new and more relentless enemy laid siege to the small ranch: the sun. After the deluge came the drought. The sky, once a canvas of bruised purple and violent gray, settled into a pale, merciless blue. The sun was not a source of life. It was a hammer, beating down on the land day after day, turning the mud to dust and the dust to a fine, choking powder. The ranch, already scarred by neglect, began to truly die. The creek that bordered the property, once swollen and brown, shrank to a muddy trickle where buzzards gathered in patient, ominous circles. The grass in the small pasture turned a sickly yellow, then a brittle brown, crackling underfoot like old paper. The earth itself split open, a network of deep fissures spreading across the yard as if the land were groaning in agony. The fences, their posts loosened by the flood and now baked by the sun, began to cant and lean, the rails splintering away. It was a slow, agonizing decay, and it seemed to mirror a decay within Ethan himself. He began to work with a grim, punishing ferocity, as if he could beat the dying land back to life with the sheer force of his will. He rose before the sun had even hinted at its arrival, and did not return to the cabin until long after dark, his body a silhouette of exhaustion against the star-dusted sky. He threw himself at the failing ranch, mending the rotten fences, digging the well deeper in a desperate search for water, patching the barn roof that leaked dust instead of rain. He was a man at war with his own failure, and the land was his battlefield. Clara watched him, a silent observer of his self-inflicted penance. She saw the new lines of exhaustion carved around his eyes, saw the way his broad shoulders slumped when he thought she was not looking. She saw him foregoing meals, pushing himself past the point of endurance, his shirt plastered to his back with sweat from dawn till dusk, and she could not bear to simply watch. One morning, as he prepared to spend another day redigging a post hole in the baked, unyielding earth. She stood before him, blocking his path to the door. "I will help you," she said. It was not a question. He barely glanced at her, picking up a pair of worn leather gloves from the table. "This is no work for you." "I am stronger than I look," she insisted, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance he was beginning to recognize. "And I will not sit idle while this place, my home, falls to pieces around us." A muscle worked in his jaw. He looked at her hands, the skin still pale and relatively smooth. He shook his head. "You will do nothing but hurt yourself." But she would not be moved. Every day, she followed him out into the punishing heat. He did not teach her. He simply worked, and she learned by watching, by mimicking his movements, by a sheer, stubborn refusal to be defeated. She learned to use a post-hole digger, her small frame struggling against the weight of it, her arms jarring with each thrust into the concrete hard ground. She learned to haul buckets of the precious, murky water from the deepened well to the wilting plants in her small garden. She learned to stretch barbed wire, the sharp points tearing at her dress and her skin. Her hands, as he had predicted, were a casualty of the battle. The soft skin of her palms blistered first, then broke, leaving angry, weeping sores. Every evening, she would soak them in salt water, biting her lip against the sting, and every morning, she would wrap them in clean rags and go out to face the day's labor. She never complained. She never asked for his help. She simply worked, her face set in a mask of grim determination, her movements becoming more efficient, her body leaner and harder. And slowly, without a word ever being spoken, she earned his respect. It was not a thing he gave freely. It was a thing that was wrested from him by the sight of her quiet courage. He began to leave a tin cup of water for her on a fence post. He started sharpening the blade of the small hand axe she used to chop kindling, leaving it propped by the door for her. One afternoon, as she struggled to lift a heavy fence rail into place, his shadow fell over her. He came and stood beside her, and without a word, they lifted it together, their hands separated by only a few inches of rough, splintered wood. They did not look at each other, but in that shared moment of effort, a new kind of silence grew between them, one that was not heavy with resentment, but filled with a quiet, mutual understanding. The sky had been threatening for days, the horizon a hazy, bruised line that promised a storm that never came. The air was thick and still, heavy with a tension that mirrored their own. The last of their small herd of cattle had wandered, seeking out the sparse patches of grass in the high country, and they had to be brought back down before the weather finally broke. "We'll ride out at first light," Ethan announced one evening, his voice rough with fatigue. "The storm will come tomorrow. I can feel it." Clara nodded, her heart giving a small, nervous flutter. She had ridden before, on gentle mares in the manicured parks back in Ohio, but the thought of riding across this wild, broken country was another matter entirely. They set out in the pre-dawn gray, the air cool and tasting of dust. Ethan rode a tall bay gelding, his body moving with the easy, natural grace of a man who was more at home in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. He had given Clara the smaller of his 2 horses, a steady mare named Bess, who seemed blessedly calm. They rode in silence for hours, climbing into the rolling, rock-strewn hills that bordered the ranch. The oppressive stillness of the morning began to give way as the sun rose higher, the wind picking up, carrying the metallic tang of ozone. By mid-afternoon, the sky to the west was a roiling mass of dark, angry clouds. They found the cattle in a small, sheltered canyon. As they began to drive the small herd back towards the lowlands, the storm broke with a sudden, shocking violence. A low, guttural rumble of thunder rolled through the hills, and a jagged fork of lightning split the sky, striking a tall pine on a nearby ridge with an explosive crack. Bess, the steady, calm mare, became a creature of pure terror. She screamed, a high, panicked sound, and bolted. Clara, caught by surprise, was nearly unseated. She lost a stirrup, her hands slipping on the reins as she fought for control. The world became a dizzying, terrifying blur of motion as the horse galloped blindly across the rocky, uneven ground. Ethan's shout was lost in the roar of the wind. He was on her in moments, his own horse stretched out in a full gallop, its hooves thundering on the hard-packed earth. He drew alongside her, his face a mask of fierce concentration. "Give me the reins!" he yelled over the storm. Her fingers were numb, locked in a death grip on the leather. She could not make them obey. He leaned far out of his own saddle, a dangerous, reckless maneuver, and snatched the runaway reins from her grasp. With a powerful tug, he began to slow the terrified mare, but another flash of lightning, closer this time, sent Bess into a renewed frenzy. She shied violently, stumbling on the loose rock. Clara was thrown. She felt a moment of weightlessness, a strange, surreal calm, before the ground rushed up to meet her. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, and she saw a brief, blinding flash of stars. Before she could even process what had happened, Ethan was there. He had thrown himself from his own horse, landing and rolling with a practiced ease, and was kneeling over her, his hands hovering a few inches from her body, as if he were afraid to touch her. "Clara!" Her name was a raw, desperate sound, torn from his throat. "Are you hurt?" She took a gasping, ragged breath, the air returning to her lungs with a painful rush. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, splattering in the dust around them. She shook her head, her vision slowly clearing. I think I am all right." The relief that washed over his face was so profound, so stark, that it left him utterly exposed. The storm broke in earnest then, the rain coming down in a cold, driving sheet. In seconds, they were both soaked through. He helped her to her feet, his hands gentle but firm on her arms. They stood there for a long moment, the world dissolving into a chaos of wind and water. The lost cattle and terrified horses forgotten. They were alone in the heart of the tempest. Then, her knees buckled, her strength gave out, and she sagged against him. He caught her, his arm wrapping securely around her waist, pulling her flush against his body. They collapsed together into the soft, rain-soaked earth, a tangle of limbs and gasping breaths. The mud was cold and slick beneath them, the rain plastering her hair to her face and his shirt to the hard muscles of his chest. He was breathing hard, his face inches from hers. She could feel the solid warmth of him, the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her own. Their eyes met, and in that long, silent moment, the rest of the world fell away. There was no ranch, no debt, no past, no future. There was only the sound of the rain, the rumble of distant thunder, and the sight of his dark, haunted eyes, now filled with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen there before. The steam of their mingled breath rose in the cold air between them. That night, something had irrevocably changed. The silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer a wall, but a space, charged with a new and terrifying awareness. Ethan had a long, deep scrape along his forearm from his fall, and his cheek was bruised where it had hit the ground. After their silent meal, as he sat staring into the fire, Clara came to him with a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. "Let me see to your arm," she said softly. "It's nothing," he grunted, not looking at her. It was his armor, his reflexive denial of any need, any weakness. "Please," she whispered. He hesitated. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he held out his arm. She knelt before him, her touch as careful and trembling as it had been on that first night when he had built the fire. She cleaned the dirt from the scrape, her fingers light and gentle. He sat rigid as stone, his jaw tight, watching her. He could feel the warmth of her breath on his skin, could smell the faint, clean scent of rain in her hair. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he whispered, his voice a low, rough rasp. She looked up at him then, her eyes wide and dark in the firelight. "I'm not," she said, and she meant it, but her voice broke on the word, betraying the tremor that still lived deep inside her, the ghost of an old fear that had nothing to do with him. He reached out, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a touch so light it was barely there. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the desire warring with the fear, a battle that mirrored his own. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not move. She closed her eyes. A silent surrender. Their kiss was not the passionate embrace of practiced lovers. It was hesitant, uncertain, a question and an answer all at once. It was the soft, trembling pressure of his lips against hers, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of fear and loneliness. It was aching and sad and beautiful, filled with all the words they could not say. It tasted of rain and dust and a desperate, shared longing. When they broke apart, the air was thick with a new and dangerous intimacy. Ethan looked at her lips, slightly parted, at the flush on her cheeks, and a wave of something dark and powerful washed over him. It was not tenderness. It was guilt, sharp and suffocating. He saw his brother's face, pale and dying in the mud. He heard his own promise, a vow to never hurt, to build something good. And this feeling, this woman, this kiss, it felt like a betrayal. He was a man who brought ruin to everything he touched. He had no right to this, no right to her. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. He could not look at her. "I have to go to town," he said, his voice a choked, unnatural sound. "Now, in the dark?" she asked, her voice small and confused. He did not answer. He grabbed his coat and was gone, the cabin door slamming shut behind him, leaving her alone with the crackling fire and the ghost of a kiss that had changed everything. He rode hard for redemption, the pounding of his horse's hooves a desperate rhythm against the silence of the night. He was not going for supplies. He was running. He went to the one place in town that offered oblivion, the saloon, a place filled with the smell of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and casual despair. He drank, trying to silence the feelings that were tearing him apart, trying to burn away the memory of her softness, the taste of her lips. Meanwhile, Clara's own ordeal was not yet over. The next day, one of their few remaining neighbors, a sour-faced woman named Martha, rode over on the pretense of borrowing some thread. Her eyes were sharp and assessing, missing nothing. She saw the new awareness in Clara's face, the faint bruise still visible on her cheek from the fall. "Heard you took a tumble up in the hills," Martha said, her voice laced with a false sweetness. "You must be careful. A man like that, with his tempers, a woman could get hurt, especially a bought woman. You have to be mindful of the merchandise." The words, spoken with such casual cruelty, left Clara feeling cold and hollow. She gave the woman her thread and sent her on her way, the insult clinging to her like a shroud. Ethan returned late that night. Clara was waiting up for him, a single lamp burning on the table. The moment he stumbled through the door, she knew. The smell of cheap whiskey rolled off him in waves, and he moved with an unsteady, exaggerated care. His eyes, when they met hers, were bloodshot and filled with a wild, desperate pain. A confrontation, inevitable and necessary, erupted between them. It was not loud or violent, but it was raw and painful, a lancing of the wounds they had both been nursing in silence. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "Where I belong," he slurred, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "With the other broken things." "You left me," she said, the accusation stark and simple. "I'm no good for you, Clara," he said, his voice cracking. "Don't you see that? Everything I touch, I destroy." He gestured wildly around the decaying cabin. "Look at this place. Look at me." "And what of me?" she cried, her own pain finally spilling over. "Did you ever think of me? I face them in the town. I face them out here. They call me a whore. They call me your bought woman. And you run away to a bottle because you are afraid of a single kiss." Her words hit him harder than any physical blow. The drunken haze seemed to clear from his eyes, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated agony. He saw it all then, his shame, her shame, the ugly, tangled mess they were in. The weight of it all was too much to bear. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to his knees on the rough planked floor. His head bowed. The proud, silent man was gone, replaced by a broken child. He looked up at her, his face a ruin of guilt and despair. "I don't know how to be gentle anymore," he whispered. The words a confession of his deepest failure, a plea for an absolution he did not deserve. The anger drained out of Clara, replaced by a wave of overwhelming compassion. This was the truth of him, the raw, wounded heart he kept hidden beneath layers of anger and silence. She went to him and knelt in front of him. She reached out and cupped his rough, unshaven face in her hands, her touch firm and steady. He flinched but did not pull away. He looked into her eyes, searching for the condemnation he was sure he would find there. But he saw only a deep, quiet strength and a tenderness that mirrored the one he fought so hard to deny in himself. "Then learn," she whispered, her voice soft but unbreakable. "Learn with me." The promise to learn together was a fragile seedling planted in scorched earth. In the days that followed his drunken collapse and her quiet offer of grace, a new, tentative world began to take shape within the four walls of the cabin. The silence was still present, but it had changed its nature. It was no longer a weapon or a wall, but a space for observation, a quiet territory where they watched each other, learning the rhythms of their separate sorrows. He was more careful with her, his movements less abrupt, his gaze less inclined to slide away. She, in turn, found a new courage, a willingness to meet his eyes, to hold her ground, to claim her space in their shared life. They were two people learning a new language, one spoken not in words, but in small, hesitant gestures of peace. This fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of the circuit mail rider, a gaunt man on a tired-looking mule who appeared one hot afternoon like a specter rising from the shimmering heat haze. He carried a single letter, its envelope smudged with the grime of a long journey. It was addressed to her. Clara took it with a trembling hand. Mail from back home was a thing she had given up hoping for. She recognized her mother's elegant, spidery script, and a lump of ice formed in her stomach. Ethan, who had been reshoeing one of the horses, stopped his work, the hammer held motionless in his hand. He watched her, his face unreadable. She broke the wax seal with her thumbnail and unfolded the thin, brittle paper. The words swam before her eyes, blurring and sharpening with each frantic beat of her heart. Her mother's words were stark, stripped of their usual pleasantries, blunt with the force of grief. Her father, after a short and sudden illness of the lungs, was dead. He had been buried 2 weeks past. The letter went on, each sentence a new blow. His business partner, a man she had known her entire life, had revealed himself to be a vulture, calling in debts she had not known existed. The family home was lost. Her mother was moving in with a distant cousin, a charity case. And then, the final, devastating sentence. The debt that Ethan had settled, the debt for which she was the price, was only a fraction of the total. Her father, in his desperation, had signed a further note, using the deed to Ethan's ranch, a property he did not own, as collateral. The creditors, a firm from Cheyenne, considered the property forfeit. They would be sending men to claim it. The letter slipped from her numb fingers and fluttered to the dusty ground. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the relentless sun a blinding, indifferent eye in the pale sky. It was her fault, all of it. Her father's desperation, his ruin, his death. It was a chain of events forged link by link from her own existence. She was the price of his final, desperate gamble. the one he had made to save her. And it was a gamble he had lost anyway. A dry, tearing sob escaped her throat, a sound of pure agony. Ethan was beside her in an instant. He did not speak. He simply knelt and picked up the letter, his eyes scanning the page with a swift, grim intensity. He read it, then read it again. When he looked up, his face was like granite, but his eyes held a flicker of something she had never seen before, a cold, deadly rage. He took the letter from her trembling hands, his own touch uncharacteristically gentle, and folded it carefully, as if it were a fragile, dangerous thing. He led her back into the cabin, into the relative cool of the dim interior, and sat her down in a chair. She was shaking, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that seemed to originate from the very center of her being. Guilt was a poison, and it was flooding through her, choking her. She was a curse. She had brought ruin to her own family, and now she had brought it to his doorstep. He did not try to comfort her with empty words. He moved with a quiet purpose, stoking the embers in the hearth, putting the coffee pot on to boil. He sat across from her at the table, the letter lying between them like a funeral shroud, and waited. He waited for the first storm of her grief to pass, his presence a silent, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of her despair. When she could finally speak, her voice was a hoarse whisper. "They will take it all, because of me." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His palm was rough and calloused, but his touch was steady, reassuring. "No," he said, his voice low and certain. "They will not." He looked at her, and the cold fire was back in his eyes. "This is your home. You have worked for it. You have bled for it. They will not take this place from you." He did not say, "our home." He said, "your home." And in that single word, he gave her something she had never had. He gave her a piece of the world that was hers to defend, hers to claim. He was not protecting his property. He was protecting her, and he would do it. She saw with a sudden, chilling certainty, even if it meant reverting to the man he so desperately wanted to leave behind. 2 days later, they came. They did not ride to the ranch. They were waiting in town, in the cool, dark interior of the saloon. Ethan had known they would be. He had ridden into redemption alone, telling Clara he was going for supplies. She knew it was a lie, but she did not try to stop him. She simply watched him go, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. There were 3 of them. One she recognized as Mr. Abernathy, a banker from Cheyenne she had seen once, a man with soft hands and a hard mouth. The other 2 were not bankers. They were big men with sun-squinted eyes and the casual, predatory stillness of wolves. Their coats were pulled back just enough to show the worn leather of the holsters at their hips. Ethan walked into the saloon, the batwing doors swinging shut behind him, plunging the room into a momentary gloom. He let his eyes adjust. Abernathy and his hired guns were at a table in the corner, a bottle of whiskey and several glasses between them. A few other prospectors and cowhands were scattered around the room, nursing their drinks, their eyes darting nervously between the newcomers and Ethan. Ethan walked to the bar. "Whiskey," he said to the bartender, who was polishing a glass with a rag, his movements jerky and uncertain. Ethan did not look at the men in the corner. He took the glass the bartender poured, and he waited. "Blackwood," Abernathy said, his voice smooth and confident. "I was hoping we might have a word. Save us a trip out to that poor investment of yours." Ethan turned slowly from the bar, the whiskey glass held loosely in his hand. "My ranch is not for sale." Abernathy smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "I'm afraid you misunderstand. It's no longer your ranch to sell. It was used as collateral on a defaulted loan. A tragic business. Your father-in-law's death. But business is business." He gestured to the chair at their table. "Now, we can do this the easy way. You sign the deed over to us. We give you a day to clear out your personal effects, and we all walk away." "And the hard way?" Ethan asked, his voice dangerously quiet. One of the hired guns chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "The hard way involves you getting hurt." Ethan took a slow sip of his whiskey. He set the glass down on the bar with a soft click. "The deed is in my wife's name now." He lied, his gaze steady. "And she is not signing it. The woman is part of the collateral, as I see it," Abernathy said with a dismissive wave of his soft hand. That was the moment the old rage, the thing he kept chained in the darkest corner of his soul, broke free. It was not a conscious decision. It was a reflex, as swift and as deadly as a striking snake. He moved, not like a man, but like a force of nature. He crossed the space between the bar and the table in the 2 long strides. Before the hired gun could even think to draw his weapon, Ethan had grabbed the whiskey bottle from the table and brought it down in a brutal, sweeping arc against the side of the man's head. The bottle shattered, and the man collapsed with a grunt, whiskey and blood soaking his collar. The second gunman was on his feet, his chair crashing over backwards, his hand grabbing for his pistol, but he was too slow. Ethan drove his fist into the man's gut, a short, savage blow that doubled him over. Gasping for air, Ethan grabbed the back of his head and slammed his face down onto the thick oak table. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the man went limp. Abernathy stared, his face white with shock and terror, his mouth hanging open. Ethan turned to him, his eyes blazing with a light that was not sane. The red haze of battle, a feeling he had not known since the war, was upon him. He was not Ethan Blackwood, the broken rancher. He was the man who had survived the burning fields of Tennessee, a man who knew how to kill. But as he took a step toward the terrified banker, a sharp, blinding pain erupted in his side. The first gunman, dazed but not unconscious, was back on his feet. He had not drawn his pistol. He held a long, wicked-looking knife, and he had just driven it deep into Ethan's ribs. Ethan staggered back, a gasp of pain and surprise escaping his lips. He looked down and saw the dark wood handle of the knife protruding from his side, a blossoming red stain spreading across his shirt. The gunman lunged again, but the wound had not slowed Ethan. It had only fed the rage. He caught the man's wrist, twisting it with a brutal strength until the bone snapped. The man screamed, the knife clattering to the floor. Ethan hit him once, a final, devastating blow to the jaw that sent him crashing into a wall, where he slid to the floor in a heap and did not move again. Ethan stood in the center of the room, breathing in deep, ragged gasps, his body swaying. He looked at the carnage around him, at the 2 broken men on the floor and the third, Abernathy, cowering under the table. He was trembling, not from exertion but from the horror of what he had so easily become again. He had kept his promise. He had protected her home, but he had broken the other promise, the one he had made to his dying brother. He had hurt another soul. In truth, he had nearly killed 2 of them. He stumbled out of the saloon, leaving Abernathy to his terror, and made his way to his horse. He pulled himself into the saddle, his side a searing agony, and turned the horse for home. Clara found him slumped over the horse's neck in the yard, the reins loose in his hand. The horse was standing patiently, as if it knew its rider was at the end of his strength. He was covered in blood, some of it his, some of it not. His face was a pale, ghastly white under a layer of grime and sweat. She did not scream. She did not cry. The fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her mind was unnaturally clear. She helped him down from the horse, his full weight leaning on her, and half dragged, half carried him into the cabin. He collapsed onto the bed, his breathing shallow and ragged. She tore his shirt away. The knife was gone, but the wound it had left was deep and ugly, a dark, weeping gash in his side. For the rest of that night, she was no longer the frightened girl from back east. She was a woman fighting to save her husband. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, her hands steady as he gritted his teeth against the fiery pain. She found her sewing kit, the one she used for mending dresses, and with a needle and thread, she stitched the torn edges of his skin together, her movements precise and sure. She washed the blood from his face and chest, revealing a landscape of new bruises and old scars. She tended to him through the long, dark hours, his body scarred but alive. His recovery was slow and painful. For days, he was lost in a fevered haze, tossing and turning, muttering the names of men she did not know, seeing battles she could not imagine. She stayed by his side, bathing his face with cool water, forcing broth between his cracked lips, holding his hand when he cried out in his sleep from the nightmares that haunted him. In those long, quiet hours of his convalescence, their bond deepened in a way she had never thought possible. In his weakness, she found her strength, and in his vulnerability, he was forced to accept her care, to trust her in a way he had never trusted anyone. There were quiet moments of a new and profound tenderness. One afternoon, he woke from a nightmare, his body drenched in sweat. A cry caught in his throat. He found her sitting in the chair beside the bed, holding his hand. He did not pull away. He simply tightened his grip, and they stayed that way until he fell back into a peaceful sleep. As he grew stronger, a new and unfamiliar sound began to fill the cabin. Laughter. It started as a small thing. She was trying to feed him a spoonful of soup, and her hand slipped, spilling it down his chin. He looked so surprised, so indignant, that she let out a small, involuntary giggle. A slow smile spread across his face, the first real smile she had ever seen from him, and he chuckled. A low, rusty sound. The sound was so unexpected, so beautiful, that it made her heart ache. But as the life inside their cabin began to mend, the world outside turned against them. The story of the saloon brawl had spread through Redemption like a prairie fire. Abernathy had painted Ethan as a savage, a madman who had attacked them without provocation. The townspeople, already wary of the silent, scarred man who lived on the edge of their world, were quick to believe it. They called him a savage, a killer, and they had a new name for her. She was no longer just the bought woman. She was the savage's whore, the woman who would stand by a man capable of such brutality. They faced a new kind of isolation. When she went into town for the few supplies they could afford, the storekeeper, Silas, would serve her in stony silence, placing the goods on the counter and backing away as if she were carrying a plague. The other women would turn their backs on her, their whispers following her down the street. They were outcasts, forced to live in a world that consisted only of their small, failing ranch and each other. One evening, weeks after the fight, Ethan was finally strong enough to sit on the porch and watch the sun set. A storm was building in the distance, the same way it had on the night he had told her of his past. The low, guttural rumble of thunder rolled across the plains. He was staring at the horizon, his face grim, the memory of the fight still a dark shadow in his eyes. Clara came and stood beside him. She had been watching him all day, seeing the way his guilt was eating at him, the way he flinched from his own shadow. She could not bear his pain any longer. "I love you, Ethan," she said, her voice soft but clear in the still, heavy air. He turned to look at her, his face a mask of utter disbelief. He thought he had misheard her. He searched her eyes, looking for a sign of pity, of mockery, of some cruel joke. He found only a deep, unwavering sincerity. "What did you say?" he whispered. "I love you," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. He shook his head, a look of profound anguish on his face. "How can you?" he asked, his voice cracking. "After what I've done? You saw what I am. I am a violent man. I am a killer." She reached out and laid her hand on his cheek, her touch gentle. "I saw a man who was willing to walk into hell to protect his wife." She answered softly, "I don't love you in spite of what you have done, Ethan. I love you because of what you have endured." His defenses, The walls he had spent years building around his heart crumbled to dust. Her words were not just an acceptance of his darkness, they were an embrace of it. She was not afraid of his scars. She saw them for what they were, a map of his survival. He stood up and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "Clara," he whispered, her name a prayer, an apology, a declaration all in one. As the first drops of rain began to fall, he led her back into the cabin. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon and in their hearts finally broke. They gave in to the longing that had been a silent, aching presence between them for so long. It was not a gentle coming together. It was intense, vulnerable, a collision of two solitudes. It was a union that felt both desperate and sacred. A prayer whispered in the dark as the thunder roared outside, shaking the very foundations of the small cabin that had become their entire world. In each other's arms, two broken halves, for the first time, became something whole. The peace they found in each other's arms was a quiet, desperate thing, a shelter built in the path of a hurricane. For a time, in the small world contained within the cabin walls, there was a stillness. They moved around each other with a new, tender awareness. A shared look across the table, the brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a cup, the way she would wait for the sound of his footsteps at the end of the day. These were the bricks and mortar of their new life, but the world outside their door was relentless, and it would not be ignored. The drought did not break. It tightened its grip. The sun rose each day not as a promise of light, but as a judgment, bleaching the color from the sky and baking the life from the earth. The small garden Clara had tended with such care withered, the leaves of the bean plants turning black and crisp, the corn stalks standing like brittle skeletons. The last of their cattle grew gaunt, their ribs showing like washboards beneath their dusty hides, their lowing a weak, mournful sound in the vast, empty silence. One morning they found the oldest cow dead by the dried-up creek bed, its eyes already gone, pecked out by the ever-present buzzards. Hunger, once a distant threat, became a quiet, constant presence in the cabin. They began to measure their days in spoonfuls of flour and handfuls of dried beans. One evening, as they shared a meager meal of thin corn mush, Ethan pushed his tin plate away, his face grim in the lamplight. "The larder is almost empty," he said, his voice flat. "There is a settlement, 2 days' ride north. They say the drought is not so bad there. I can trade for flour and salt pork." Clara looked at him, her heart sinking. 2 days' ride north meant 4 days. At least, that he would be gone. The thought of being left alone in this vast, hostile emptiness was a cold fist of fear in her gut. She had come to depend on his presence, on the solid, reassuring weight of him in their small world. "I will be fine," she said, her voice betraying none of the fear she felt. She had learned to be strong for him, to be the calm harbor to his turbulent sea. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face, and he saw the lie. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I will ride hard. I will be back before you know it." The morning he left was clear and cold. He had packed a small bedroll and filled his canteens with the last of the clean water from the well. He stood before her on the porch, his horse saddled and waiting. He did not kiss her. Their intimacy was still too new, too fragile for such public displays, even with no one but the empty prairie to see. But he touched her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Lock the door behind me," he said, his voice low. "Do not open it for anyone." She nodded, unable to speak. She watched him ride away, a lone, dark figure shrinking against the enormous, indifferent landscape, until he was nothing more than a speck, and then he was gone. The silence he left behind was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered all other sound. She spent the next 2 days in a state of heightened vigilance. Every gust of wind was the sound of approaching horses, every shadow the figure of a man. She worked, keeping her hands and mind busy, mending their clothes, sweeping the already spotless cabin floor, tending to the few scrawny chickens that still scratched in the dust. But the loneliness was a constant ache. The cabin felt too large without him, the nights terrifyingly dark and long. On the third day, they came. She was outside, gathering the few eggs the chickens had laid, when she heard the sound of horses. It was not the steady, familiar rhythm of Ethan's gelding. It was the sound of multiple horses, moving at a lazy, confident pace. Her blood ran cold. She hurried back inside, her heart hammering against her ribs, and slid the heavy wooden bar across the door, just as he had told her to. She peered through a small chink in the log wall. There were two of them. They were rough men, their faces burned by the sun and covered in several days' growth of beard. They were not from redemption. Their clothes were ragged, their horses lean and mean-looking. They reined in their horses in the yard, their eyes scanning the small, pathetic ranch with a look of casual, predatory assessment. They were bandits, scavengers who preyed on the weak and the isolated. "Hello, the house," one of them called out, his voice a gravelly shout. "Anyone home?" Clara held her breath, pressing herself against the wall, trying to make herself invisible. "Looks empty," the second man said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "But I smell smoke, and there's chickens." "Well, let's make ourselves welcome," the first one said with a grin that showed several missing teeth. He dismounted and strode to the cabin door. He tried the handle, and finding it locked, he banged his fist against the wood. "Open up. We are just thirsty travelers. Looking for a dipper of water." Clara remained silent, her breath caught in her throat. The man's pretense of friendliness vanished. "I said, open the door. You hear me? Or we will open it for you." When she did not respond, he kicked the door. The heavy wood shuddered in its frame. He kicked it again and again. The sound of brutal, rhythmic booming that echoed the frantic beating of her own heart. With a final, splintering crash, the wooden bar broke, and the door flew open. The two men stood in the doorway, their large bodies silhouetted against the blinding afternoon sun. For a moment, they did not see her in the dim interior. Then, the first man's eyes adjusted, and they settled on her, a slow, ugly smile spreading across his face. Well, what do we have here?" he said, his eyes crawling over her, stripping her bare. "Looks like the man of the house is away." Clara backed away, her hand instinctively reaching for the iron poker that rested by the hearth. The men stepped inside, their presence filling the small cabin, bringing with them the smell of sweat, leather, and unwashed bodies. "No need to be unfriendly, little lady," the second man said, his eyes darting around the sparse cabin, taking inventory of their few possessions. "We are just going to help ourselves to a few things your husband will not be needing." They moved through the cabin with a brutal efficiency, tearing open her trunk, scattering her few dresses on the floor. They found the small sack of flour Ethan had left her and the last of the salted bacon. They were not just taking what they needed to survive. They were taking pleasure in the act of destruction, in the violation of her home. When the first man reached for the small, silver-backed locket that had been her mother's, something inside Clara snapped. "No!" she cried, lunging forward, the poker held in front of her like a sword. "You will not take that!" The man laughed, easily batting the poker aside with his forearm. He grabbed her wrist, his fingers biting into her flesh like a steel trap. "Feisty, ain't she?" he said to his companion. He twisted her arm behind her back, forcing a cry of pain from her lips. With his other hand, he ripped the locket from her neck. He pushed her, hard, and she stumbled and fell, her head striking the edge of the table with a sickening thud. The room spun, and for a moment, darkness threatened to swallow her. Through a haze of pain, she saw them leave, laughing as they rode away with the last of their food and the last piece of her old life. She lay on the floor for a long time, the silence of the violated cabin pressing down on her. When she finally managed to pull herself up, her head was throbbing, and a large, tender bruise was already forming on her cheek. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the profound sense of shame and terror that had settled deep in her soul. She was alive, but she felt as though a part of her had been destroyed. Ethan returned the next day. He saw the broken door from 100 yards away, and he spurred his horse into a frantic gallop. He found the place ransacked. The chickens slaughtered in the yard, their feathers scattered in the dust like a bizarre, bloody snow. He found Clara sitting on the bed, staring at the wall, her eyes hollow and empty. He saw the bruise on her cheek, a dark, ugly stain against her pale skin. He knelt in front of her, his heart a cold, dead weight in his chest. "Clara," he said, his voice a choked whisper. "Did they—" He could not bring himself to finish the question. She looked at him then, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on her face. "They took everything," she whispered. "But I am alive." He looked at her bruised face, her empty eyes, and the cold weight in his chest ignited into a white-hot flame of pure, unadulterated rage. It was the same rage he had felt in the saloon, but this was different. This was not about a piece of paper or a man's insult. This was a violation of the one sacred thing in his desolate world. They had hurt her. They had put their hands on her. He stood up, his body trembling with a terrible, silent fury. The man who had been learning to be gentle was gone, burned away in an instant. In his place stood the man from Tennessee, the man who knew only how to destroy. He did not speak. He walked to the wall where his rifle was mounted, took it down, and checked the action. He went to his saddlebags and took out a box of cartridges. He turned to leave. "Ethan, no!" she pleaded, her voice finding its strength. "Do not go. It is not worth it. Let them go." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were the eyes of a stranger, as cold and gray as a winter sky. "They hurt you," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They will not live to hurt anyone else." He rode out, not on the trail north, but west, toward the broken country of canyons and ravines. He was no longer a rancher. He was a hunter, and he was tracking the most dangerous game of all. The tracks were easy to follow. The men were arrogant, confident in their isolation. He found their camp by nightfall, in a small box canyon. A fire was burning, and he could hear their rough laughter echoing off the rock walls. He did not attack them in the dark. That was not his way. He waited, his rage a cold, patient thing. He waited for the dawn. As the first gray light of morning filtered into the canyon, he made his move. He came at them on foot, his rifle held at the ready. They were just stirring from their bedrolls. He shot the first man before he was even fully awake. A single, clean shot to the chest. The man collapsed without a sound. The second man scrambled for his pistol, his eyes wide with terror. He managed to fire one wild shot that ricocheted off the canyon wall. Before he could fire again, Ethan was on him. He did not use his rifle. He used his hands. He drove the man to the ground, his fist rising and falling in a brutal, savage rhythm. And then, as he knelt over the broken, bleeding man, a voice broke through the red haze of his rage. It was Clara's voice, clear and soft in his memory. "Then learn with me." He stopped, his fist raised for another blow. He looked down at the man cowering beneath him, at the blood and the terror, and he saw himself. He saw the monster he had become again, and a wave of such profound self-loathing washed over him that it nearly brought him to his knees. He stood up, his body trembling, and backed away from the man. He spared him. He left him there, broken and bleeding, in the canyon with his dead companion. It was not mercy. It was a punishment for both of them. He returned home as a drenching, cold rain began to fall, washing the dust and the blood from the cursed land. He found Clara waiting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. She had been waiting all night. He slid from his horse, his body moving with the slow, stiff movements of an old man. He was soaked to the skin, his face pale and silent. She looked at him, her eyes searching his, and in their haunted depths. She saw the answer to the question she had been afraid to ask. Her gaze was not accusatory, it was gentle, filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding. "Did you keep your promise?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper in the falling rain. He stood before her, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, and the last of his strength seemed to drain out of him. He shook his head, a single, slow movement of defeat. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking, "but I tried." The next day, they buried the last of the dead cattle together. They dug a deep pit in the hard, unforgiving earth, their movements slow and synchronized. The land felt cursed, a place of death and failure. But as they worked, side by side, their bond, forged in violence and loss, grew stronger, unbreakable. In the days that followed, a profound shift occurred between them. The fragile girl who had arrived trembling in a storm was gone. In her place was a woman of quiet, unshakable strength. She became the one who steadied him when he woke in the night from the nightmares that had returned with a vengeance. She was there, her hand on his chest, her soft voice pulling him back from the brink. She did not condemn him for what he had done. She taught him forgiveness, not with words, but with her unwavering acceptance of the darkness that lived inside him. One night, as the wind howled outside the cabin, a lonely, mournful sound, he finally broke. He sat at the table, his head in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. Clara went to him and wrapped her arms around him, holding him as he had once longed to hold her. And he told her everything. He told her about his brother, Samuel, the boy who had written poetry and had died in a field of fire and blood. He told her about the guilt that had been his constant companion for years, the terrible, illogical guilt of the survivor. "He was the good one, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "He was the one who deserved to live. I was the hard one, the one who knew how to kill. It should have been me." She held him tighter, her cheek resting against his hair. She did not offer empty platitudes. She did not tell him it was not his fault. She simply held him, absorbing his grief, sharing the terrible weight of it. She was his anchor in the storm of his own memory, the one steady point in his spinning, broken world. Their love, born in a transaction and nurtured in hardship, transformed into something new. It was not a soft, gentle thing. It was a fierce, wild, and redemptive love, a love that had looked into the face of ugliness and had not flinched. It was a love born not from perfection, but from the shared, stubborn, beautiful fact of their endurance. The sky had been a strange, sickly yellow all day, the air thick and heavy, pressing down with a suffocating weight. There were no birds in the sky, no sound from the insects in the dry grass. A deep, unnatural silence had fallen over the land, the kind of quiet that comes before a scream. By late afternoon, the western horizon had turned the color of a deep bruise, a roiling wall of black and purple clouds that climbed higher and higher, swallowing the light. This was not a normal storm. This was a monster, a thing of legend, the kind old men spoke of in hushed, fearful tones. The first gust of wind was a physical blow, bending the few skeletal trees in the yard almost to the ground. It was followed not by rain, but by hail. Stones of ice the size of robins' eggs that hammered against the roof of the cabin with the sound of 1,000 frantic drums. Ethan and Clara worked in a desperate, synchronized silence, their movements stripped of all wasted motion. They herded the last of their chickens into the relative safety of the barn and fought to barricade the doors against the rising wind. They secured the 2 horses in their stalls, the animals' eyes wide with terror, their nostrils flaring at the scent of the coming storm. As they ran back to the cabin, the rain began, a solid, blinding wall of water that turned the world to a gray, churning chaos. They slammed the cabin door shut, the wind tearing at it, and slid the new, thick bar Ethan had carved into place. The cabin, their small, hard-won sanctuary, was plunged into a deep twilight, and then the thunder began. It was not the rolling, grumbling thunder of a summer storm. It was a physical concussion, a series of deafening, explosive cracks that seemed to come from the very ground beneath their feet. The log walls trembled, the floorboards vibrating with each new assault. Dust and bits of dried moss rained down from the rafters. Clara looked at Ethan, her eyes wide in the gloom, and in that moment, she was thrown back to her first night in this place. The same thunder, the same trembling walls, the same feeling of being a small, helpless thing in the face of an overwhelming, violent power. But this time, she was not alone. This time, when she looked at the man across the room, she did not see a stranger. She saw her husband, her anchor, her home. He met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw not coldness, but a fierce, protective resolve. The storm raged for hours. A relentless, deafening assault. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the roof, trying to peel the shingles away one by one. And then they heard a new sound, a deep, menacing roar that was not the wind or the thunder. Ethan went to the single window, wiping the condensation from the pane. He stared out into the darkness for a long moment before turning back to her, his face grim. "The creek," he said, his voice barely audible over the din. "It's broken its banks." The water came quickly. It was a dark, churning tide, filled with uprooted trees and the debris of a world being torn apart. It flooded the yard, rising with a terrifying speed. It lapped at the porch, then began to seep under the door, a dark, cold stain spreading across the floorboards. They piled their few blankets and sacks of food on top of the table, working together in the rising water, their movements urgent and desperate. It was a flash of lightning, a brilliant, blinding fork that lit up the entire prairie, that brought the new and final horror. It struck a massive, dead cottonwood tree on the edge of their property, and the tree exploded in a shower of sparks. In the howling, rain-soaked wind, the fire did not die. It spread. A hungry orange line that raced through the dry grass, a terrifying counterpoint to the floodwaters. Fire and water, the world's two great destructive forces, had come to claim their small piece of land. They watched in stunned silence as the fire, fanned by the gale-force winds, leaped from the grass to the dry, weathered wood of the barn. The structure went up not in minutes, but in seconds, a great, whooshing roar as the flames consumed the old wood, lighting up the night in a hellish, dancing glow. Clara let out a choked cry, thinking of the horses trapped inside, and then a burning ember, carried on the wind like a malevolent messenger, landed on the roof of the cabin. It caught in a patch of dry moss near the chimney, and a small, bright orange flower of flame bloomed against the dark, wet shingles. At first, it seemed impossible that it could survive in the deluge, but the wind was its ally. It fanned the small flame, nurturing it, protecting it from the rain, until it grew into a hungry lick of fire that began to eat its way into the dry wood of the roof. Smoke, thick and acrid, began to seep through the ceiling, and the air in the cabin became hot and difficult to breathe. "We have to get out," Ethan yelled, grabbing her arm. He kicked at the broken door, forcing it open against the pressure of the floodwaters outside, which were now nearly knee-deep. He pushed her out onto the porch, into the maelstrom of wind and rain and smoke. "Get to the high ground, by the rocks, now!" She scrambled through the cold, rushing water, her skirt a heavy, sodden weight around her legs. When she reached the small outcropping of rocks that marked the edge of their property, she turned back, expecting him to be right behind her, but he was not there. He was still on the porch, his hand on the doorframe, about to go back inside. "Ethan!" she screamed, her voice a thin, useless thread of sound against the roar of the storm and the fire. "What are you doing? Get out!" He turned to look at her, his face illuminated by the terrible, beautiful light of their burning home. "There are things I have to get," he yelled back. "Go! I will be right behind you." and then he disappeared back into the smoke-filled cabin. A primal scream of pure terror was torn from Clara's throat. "No, Ethan!" She started to run back, to go in after him, but the floodwater was a powerful, rushing river, and the heat from the burning cabin was an invisible wall, pushing her back. The roof was now fully engulfed in flames, a roaring pyre against the dark, stormy sky. She could only stand and watch, her hands clasped to her mouth, her heart shattering into a million pieces. He was going to die. He was going to die in the fire, and she would be left alone in this wasteland. The world dissolved into a blur of tears and rain and fire. It seemed like an eternity, but it could only have been a minute, just as a section of the roof collapsed inward with a great, whooshing groan. He emerged. He stumbled out of the doorway, half falling into the water, his body racked with great, heaving coughs. He was clutching something to his chest. He staggered through the water toward her, his face black with soot, his hair and shirt singed. He collapsed at her feet on the relative safety of the rocks, dropping the things he had saved into the mud. He had not saved their money, or his tools, or the rifle from the wall. He had saved the old, leather-bound family Bible that had been his mother's, the one where he had clumsily written their names on the page marked marriages, and clutched in the same hand, muddy but intact, was a small, faded length of blue silk ribbon. It was the ribbon from her mother's wedding dress, the one she had kept tucked away in her trunk, the last tangible piece of the girl she had once been. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands running over his face, his chest, his arms, assuring herself that he was real, that he was alive. He coughed, spitting black phlegm onto the rocks, and pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace. They clung to each other as their home, their shelter, their entire world, burned to the ground behind them, the flames reflected in their wide, tear-filled eyes. The storm, as if its work were done, began to recede with the first hint of dawn. The wind died down to a sorrowful whisper. The rain softened to a gentle, cleansing drizzle, and the fire slowly starved itself, leaving behind the blackened, skeletal remains of the cabin and the barn. The floodwaters retreated, leaving a thick, foul-smelling layer of mud over everything. The world was quiet. In the aftermath, they sat huddled together on the rocks, wrapped in a single, soot-stained blanket Ethan had managed to grab. The land was a scene of utter desolation, a blackened, muddy wasteland under a sky that was now a soft, pearly gray. But it was not dead. A single bird, somewhere in the distance, began to sing its morning song. The land was scarred, but it was alive. They sat in silence for a long time, watching as the sun rose, its first rays tinging the edge of the eastern clouds with a fragile, hopeful pink. All they had built together was gone. All they owned in the world were the wet, muddy clothes on their backs, a Bible, and a piece of blue ribbon. They had nothing left, and yet they had everything. Clara reached out and took his hand, the one that was not clutching the Bible. It was a hand scarred by war and labor, a hand that had known terrible violence. It was the hand of the man who had just risked his life to save a ribbon because he knew it mattered to her. She lifted his hand and pressed it to her heart, so he could feel its steady, rhythmic beat. She looked at him, at his soot-stained face, at the raw emotion in his tired eyes, and she finally understood the true nature of the promise he had struggled so hard to keep. "You were gentle," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Even when it hurt, even when it was hard, you were gentle." He looked at her, and the tears that had been welling in his own eyes finally spilled over, tracing clean paths through the soot on his cheeks. All the walls, all the armor, all the hardness he had used to protect his broken heart were gone, burned away in the fire of the night. "You taught me how," he whispered, his voice cracking. The story closes there, with the two of them sitting by the ashes of their past, wrapped in a single blanket against the morning chill. They were tired. They were scarred, but they were alive, and they were together. The horizon glowed with the fragile, pink promise of a new day, a promise that love, a fierce and stubborn and hard-won love, could outlast even the most violent of storms. They would rebuild, not just the cabin, but their lives, board by board, day by day, on the foundation of that simple, unbreakable truth. Thank you for gathering around the campfire with me tonight. Please comment with where you're listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.